Okay, hello and welcome to this lesson on how Marxism developed under Tsar Nicholas II. This lesson is aimed at A-level students and it's going to be particularly useful to you if you're an AQA history student and you're studying the unit on Tsarist and Communist Russia from 1855 to 1964. However, it's also going to be useful if you're generally interested in Marxism or in the collapse of the autocracy under Tsar Nicholas II in Russia. So what you're going to want to do for this lesson is get yourself a pen and paper, start by getting this title down, and then we've got quite a few key words that we'll need to get the definitions of. So if you want to pause the video here so you can catch up on those definitions, that's absolutely fine. And what I'll do next is go through some of the explanations of these words. So starting then with Marxism. Marxism is often seen as another word for communism or sort of extreme socialism. The definition I've given it here is scientific socialism. So let's unpack that a little bit. Socialism is the idea that the social classes in the world, so the working class, the middle class, and then the bourgeoisie at the top, they should basically be closer together, or the more radical socialists believe they should be done away with completely and everyone should be equal. Now that belief has existed for a very, very long time, arguably thousands of years you could make a case for. But what had not existed before Marxism was the idea of scientific socialism. So before, socialism was a moral position. It was a moral argument that everyone should be treated the same and be equal. Marxism tried to take that moral argument and add what they argued was a science to it. So they believed that they'd been able to analyze history and explain how the history of the world was developing in a direction that would lead to the outbreak of socialism. So they believed they were adding a scientific element to this moral theory of equality. So that's Marxism. We will go into more detail in this in the lesson, but that is it in a nutshell. Scientific socialism. Next key word is proletariat. A bit of a weird word if you're not used to it, but it's definitely a word to get used to. It will impress your examiners if you can use it. It means the industrial working class. So in Russia, we know hopefully that there's this new class that has been growing called the industrial working class, who have come to man all of the new factories that are being built under Sergei Witter's industrialization drive. So that new class of people, they're not serfs anymore, they're now workers in the factories, and we call them the proletariat. Now, obviously, that's just the proletariat in Russia, but it exists across the world, and Marxists refer to that class as the proletariat. Then we've got the bourgeoisie. So if you imagine at the bottom of the ladder, you have got the proletariat, the workers who are enduring these grim conditions, paid very little, working very hard, right at the bottom rung of the ladder. Then right at the very top, the factory owners, the business owners, are the bourgeoisie. There is a middle class, sort of managers, foremen in the factories, things like that. But your two big classes in Marxism are the working class, which is the vast majority, and then the bourgeoisie, the small number of very wealthy bosses at the very top. Next, we've got Marx and Engels. So this refers to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who were two German communists who came up with the theory of Marxism. Next, we've got the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. I've put those two together because they're very, very linked. Basically, there was a party of all the Marxists together in Russia, a political party called the RSDLP. And this party, and we'll unpack this a little bit more in the lesson, this party split into two. So there was a more extreme wing called the Bolsheviks, a more radical wing led by Lenin. And then there was a gentler, I suppose, a milder wing of that party called the Mensheviks. And they were led by a man called Julius Martov. They were less radical. And then at the bottom there, as I've said, we've got Lenin and Martov, the leaders of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And then also Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, who is worth knowing about now, who later becomes a leading member of the Bolsheviks during the Communist Revolution of 1917. And he's a really significant figure in Russian history. So it's good to become familiar with him now. Okay, so where are we going in today's lesson? What are our destination questions that we're going to try and answer by the end? Well, there are two. Number one, we're going to try and say, what did the Marxists believe? What is the actual set of ideas that the Marxists were putting forward? And then number two, we're going to try and say, how did Marxist opposition actually develop in practice in Russia under Tsar Nicholas II? So if the lesson is successful, we'll be able to do both those things by the end of it. Just a note before we start on a good way to approach this lesson, I recommend using the Cornell notes system. So there's an example here on the slide of what it looks like. It basically means splitting your page up into three sections. You've got a main section with your bullet points, your diagrams, and your abbreviations. That's where you're taking your basic notes. Then after the lesson, over on the left, you've got a column called Qs. And this is just single keywords, dates, names, main vocabulary words, and it's used for your review and study after the lesson. Then at the bottom, you want to write a summary, which is a 1 or 2 sentence summary of what your notes have been about in that lesson. And that'll be useful for you to find information later when you are doing your revision. Okay, so let's make a start on this. Start by looking at this image. This image shows us a famous Marxist. It was a poster produced by Marxists. What can you see in it? What do you think it's meant to show? I'll give you a few moments to take this in. Start basic. What can you see? So hopefully we notice our man at the top here with his little hat and his broom standing on top of the globe. Then we notice he's sweeping away 4 different figures. We've got a caption down here in Russian. And what do the 4 figures look like? Well, we've got some people with crowns, some religious sort of wear there. And we've got this man with his top hat and his bag of money and his rather round belly there. So who do you think these people might be meant to be? They relate to one of your keywords. See if you can say who they're supposed to be. So if you said they're the bourgeoisie, then you're absolutely right. The man at the top is Lenin, another man from your keywords, the leader of the Bolsheviks. And the caption says this: Comrade Lenin cleanses the earth of filth. And this was made in 1920 in Russia, once the Marxists had seized power. So you can see there, this is like a summary of what the Marxists want. They want to sweep out the bourgeois class. They want to get rid of the wealthy, rich people that they see as parasites, your business owners, your kings, your leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church. They want to get rid of all of them, all of the filth, as they put it, and they want to create this equal society where everyone has the same wealth level. So how did Marxism begin? Well, it was founded, as we know from our keywords, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who were 2 German communists. And what they believed was that all the socialism that had gone before was a good idea. They liked the idea in principle, morally, of equality between people. But they said it was too vague and too unscientific, a kind of head in the clouds model of socialism. And so they wanted to make it scientific. And the way they did that was they did a big analysis of history and the way that the economy under capitalism worked. And they tried to predict how socialism could come about through that. So they tried to make socialism a logical theory rather than a dream, rather than just a nice idea. Now, carrying on with what they wanted, like the social revolutionaries who we've looked at in a previous lesson, the Marxists wanted to overthrow Tsarism, but they didn't want to stop there. We know, don't we, from that image that we've just looked at, Lenin cleanses the earth of filth, they wanted much more than just getting rid of the Tsar. They wanted to totally overthrow capitalism and replace it with an egalitarian, that means equal, communist system where there are no social classes anymore. All social classes have been abolished. So it's not just making workers a bit richer and the rich a bit poorer. It's getting rid of the whole idea of rich and poor and having everyone be the same. And crucially, this is a central idea, it'd be worth highlighting in your notes. They wanted to base their ideas on the industrial working class specifically. Now, the social revolutionaries, they wanted some similar things to the Marxists, but they did not base themselves on the industrial working class. They based themselves on what they called the laboring poor, which was the industrial working class and the peasantry. So basically anyone that didn't have much money in Russia at that time, the social revolutionaries took them as their base. But the Marxists, they thought that the industrial workers in the factories specifically, they were the ones that could carry out a revolution because they had the economic power to do it. So basically, the ideology of the Marxists was an attempt to be a bit deeper and more logically rigorous than all of the radical politics that had gone before. And as we said, they claim that Marxism was actually a science. Okay. So just to get into this a little bit more deeply now, we're going to look at a quote from the Communist Manifesto. Now, it's not an easygoing quote, so we are going to take our time and we're going to go through it carefully. I'm going to try and use my highlighter. Please do not laugh at me if it goes wrong. So let's have a read of this carefully. The advance of industry. So we're just going to pause there. The advance of industry. Let's see. Oh, actually, I might try and use my laser pointer. Yeah. So the advance of industry here, that means industrialization under Sergei Witte, more and more factories. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie. So that is saying, what does the bourgeoisie mean? That's the bosses at the top. That's saying that they are accidentally creating industrialization. The capitalists, the bosses, are making the rate of factories, the number of factories grow, and it's not voluntary. They're doing it because they're competing with each other. So if you've got bourgeoisie A and bourgeoisie B, and they're competing against each other, if they're going to outdo each other, they've got to build more machinery and more factories. And so by competing, they're constantly bringing up the total number of new factories. So far, industry is advancing, and the bourgeoisie are doing that involuntarily through their competition with each other. And that replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by revolutionary combination due to association. Now, that's going to seem like a challenging section of this quote. What it's saying is the laborers before industrialization, when they were still serfs on the farm, they were isolated. Yes, they would see other people in the village mere, but only a small number, and they were illiterate, so they were isolated from the rest of the world to a large degree. Whereas when they're in the factories, they've got a revolutionary combination by association. What they mean here in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, is that the workers are all packed in tight in the same space, and they're newly literate, and so they're not isolated anymore. They're all associated together in huge numbers, and that gives them a lot of power. Let's go on. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So what it's saying here is that the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the capitalists, the bosses, the wealthy, they are accidentally creating the people that are going to come along and take them out. They're creating more and more workers, and they're packing them in these big spaces in the factories tightly together so that they're all talking to each other, sharing their radical ideas. They've all got the same interests and they're in the same place. And so those people are going to eventually be the grave diggers of capitalism. They're going to throw out the capitalist system and replace it with communism. So that's the theory. We've gone a little bit deeper than you necessarily need to for the course, but I wanted to give you an idea of what is meant by that idea of scientific socialism. They've come up here with a logical theory of why socialism isn't just a nice idea, but could actually come about through the conditions of industrialization. So hopefully that makes sense. Oh, we're stuck on my laser pointer. Let me get rid of that. Okay, so carrying on with what the Marxists wanted, as we said, they dreamed of this future society where everyone is going to work for the common good. Everyone's going to be equal and work for each other's benefit, not for money, not for private profit. And they summarized that with this quote here: from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So you do whatever you can and you receive whatever you need, rather than by buying and selling things like you would under capitalism. And they hoped that that system could deliver a world that was equal and free of war and poverty. So no one would be going hungry or wanting for anything anymore. So that covers destination question 1. Hopefully we now know what the Marxists wanted, what they were trying to bring about, and what their theory was of scientific socialism. Now we're going to come on to destination question 2, which is, what did they do? So start by looking at this picture. What can you see? So clearly we can see a public hanging here, and this is part of a long process where assassination attempts were being made by a group called the Narodniks, and then they were being publicly hanged if they were caught. But there is a twist to this one. This is actually the hanging of Lenin's brother. So Lenin, from our keywords, the leader of the Bolsheviks, Alexander Ulyanov, Lenin's brother, being hanged in 1887. So a little bit before where we're looking at in today's lesson under Tsar Alexander III. Now, Lenin was actually present at the hanging of his brother Alexander. He watched, and so the story goes, without weeping or without reacting emotionally, he turned to someone that he was with at the funeral, and he said, "We will follow a different path." So he believed in the same things as the Narodniks and as the social revolutionaries. He believed in the overthrow of Tsarism and a new egalitarian society, but he didn't believe in these methods. He didn't believe that assassinations were going to work, because Lenin saw how it ended. He saw his own brother get hanged after an assassination attempt against the Tsar. And so he decided, we will follow a different path. And that path was Marxism. So what did they do? Well, the first big event is in 1898. They have the first Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party in Minsk. This image that I've got here on the slide is actually a museum that is dedicated to that event, just that one event. And what it did was it brought together lots of different little Marxist groups and put them all under the name of that party, the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. And while they were there, they drew up a manifesto. So that's a program of their ideas, what they want to happen. And that was under the direction of Pyotr Struve, who, if you've been following this course on Satchel so far, you will know about as a liberal leader. He was someone who later defected to the liberals. What did the manifesto say? Well, it said that they believed in the forcible, the violent overthrow of capitalism, but through the mass activity of the working class themselves. And that's very different to the Narodniks. The Narodniks focused on small groups of people assassinating key Tsarist officials, bombing, carrying out acts of violence against police chiefs, and so on. But it was based on a small number of people. The Marxists, they believe in the whole mass of the working class all together, throwing out capitalism. However, it's not all plain sailing at this first Congress. So the Congress actually gets broken up by the Okhrana, the Russian secret police, and 2 of their 3-man committee that they've set up to lead the new party end up getting arrested. So it's not a good start. The secret police have come down quite heavily on them. However, a man called Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who we know as Lenin, was won to the movement, and he ended up becoming a really formidable leader for it. He was very tactically astute, very smart in how he went forward and progressed the Marxist movement. Now, Lenin clashed with another man from our keywords, which is Julius Martov. They both clashed, even though they were both Marxists, over the exact direction that the new Marxist party should go in. So this is kind of the essence of their clash. This is what they're arguing about. At the second Congress of this party in 1903, Lenin argues this. He says the party has got to make itself a party of disciplined, professional revolutionaries. So tight-knit, really, really highly disciplined. And he says they shouldn't compromise with any other political forces in Russia at that time. So no compromise with the liberals. Everyone's got to be dedicated heart and soul to revolutionary socialism, to communism and Marxism. On the other side, Martov, he argues for a sort of gentler approach. He wants a more loose and broad party, so not so intense, not so disciplined, and one that would work alongside lots of other groups that were oppositionists to the Tsar, including liberals who really only wanted a Duma and some democratic change. Now, that fight is a very close fight between those two wings of the Marxist movement, between Lenin and Martov. But Lenin narrowly wins it. And it ends up, it's such a ferocious argument that it sort of splits the party almost into two mini parties, into two wings. Lenin called his section of the party the Bolsheviks and Martov's side the Mensheviks. What those words mean is Bolshevik means majority and Menshevik means minority. Now, it's a little bit ironic because technically the majority of the party actually supported Martov and a slight minority supported Lenin. But Lenin was able to get most of the delegates at the Congress. And so he was able to win the vote that way. So it was technically not true that the Bolsheviks were the majority, but that is what those words mean. Now, the argument doesn't stop there. Although Lenin's won it, it continues to rage on for the next few years until effectively it's just two different parties that are operating under the same name. So a lot of strife between these two factions. If you just have a look at this table, I'll just give you a moment to read this. This just summarizes their broad differences. So, for example, the Mensheviks, they believed that capitalism would have to be allowed to exist for a while, would have to develop for a bit before communism could take place. The Bolsheviks thought it could happen immediately. They thought communists could seize power now. The Mensheviks, they thought communism would come about gradually. The working class would sort of learn it for themselves. The Bolsheviks, again, thought you needed disciplined professional revolutionaries to educate the working class about that. So a few differences in beliefs there. Now, just one important figure in the Marxist movement. We mentioned him in our keywords. This is Leon Trotsky. And this is just a quote from him on the issue of violence. So although we said they did not believe, like the Narodniks, in sort of random assassination attempts or sudden acts of violence from a small number of people, that's not to say the Marxists were pacifists. They did believe that the working class should violently overthrow capitalism, but just on a mass basis rather than through individual acts of terror. And so this is what Trotsky said about that. Arguments to the effect that all violence, including revolutionary violence, is evil, and that communists therefore ought not to engage in glorification of armed struggle and the Revolutionary Army, amount to a philosophy worthy of Quakers and the old maids of the Salvation Army. So Trotsky completely dismissive there of any ideas of peaceful protest like what the liberals would have been advocating at that time. I think we'll skip through that bit. So these are just some biographies of Lenin and Trotsky. You're more than welcome to replay the video to have a look through those. I just want to get to the final task now. So this is your final task. I'd like you to imagine that you're at that second Congress of the RSDLP in 1903. The argument is raging around you between Lenin on the one side and Martov on the other. How should the Marxist movement proceed? Should it be radical, tight-knit revolutionaries that want to try and seize power now? Or should it be a loose alliance of people who work with the liberals and who go more slowly, who allow capitalism to develop first? I would like you to write a letter, imagining that you've sided with one faction or the other, explaining who you have sided with and why, just to bring together some of these themes that we've been exploring in today's lesson. So we've come now to the end. Let's just remind ourselves of where we've been. We've been thinking about what did the Marxists believe, what was their actual program of scientific socialism that Marx and Engels came up with. And then we've also looked at how did Marxist opposition develop? So how did the RSDLP grow and how did it split into the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks? Thank you for listening today and good luck with the rest of your course.